Welcome to our AB 1757 public listening session. We're just giving everyone a moment to get situated and organized, but thanks for joining us. Hopefully you all can see my screen, and I hear that my Wi-Fi isn't awesome, but luckily I have a couple colleagues on the line that if my Wi-Fi completely crashes, they can pick up where we left off. So yeah, we'll give people another few seconds and then we'll dive in. Okay, let's go for it. So for folks that just joined, this is the AB 1757 public listening session. This is an opportunity mainly to hear from all of you that have been following or just stepping into the AB 1757 process and get some feedback from all of you on our work on natural and working lands, and specifically ideas for our natural and working lands targets that we need to set and determine later this year. So how we'll run this listening session is we'll go through just a few slides of sort of a reminder on AB 1757, where we're at in the process. And then we really want to turn it over to all of you to hear your feedback and constructive criticism and ideas for how we can do the best job possible in implementing this legislation. And it can be pretty organic. We will run this how we run many of our natural and working lands expert advisory committees, where if you have a question or a comment, you can just use the raise your hand feature in Teams, and Adam on the line here will keep sort of a log of the order of the hands that have been raised, and we'll call you off mute, and you can turn on your camera if you'd like, or just unmute yourself and provide any of your thoughts and reflections. Again, you know, because we're a bit of a smaller group here, we can keep it a little more organic and go from there. And I see we already have one hand up. So Joan, do you have a question? Or am I not coming through? Or maybe you were practicing.
Just putting my hand up. Yeah, thank you. And just putting my hand up for comment when you're ready.
Okay, great. So Joan, my plan is to run through a few slides just to get everyone on the same page, and then we will dig into hearing again from all of you. So we note that your hand is up, but I just want to make sure everyone has sort of the same information to start with, and then we'll dig in. We have 2 hours, and I plan to stay on the line the whole 2 hours. So if we want to talk the whole time, that's awesome. And I'm sure some other people will trickle in as the workday wraps up and they want to jump into this conversation. So bit of background now from us. So as a reminder for all of you, AB 1757 is the bill that was signed last year. We really think of it as sort of our sweeping and overarching natural and working lands bill. And it is a pretty robust bill. It calls for us at the Resources Agency, in partnership with the California Air Resources Board and the California Department of Food and Ag, to do a lot of things to advance our work on nature-based climate solutions. First and foremost, this year, it asks or requires that the Resources Agency, in partner with those agencies, as well as this Natural and Working Lands Expert Advisory Committee, determine a range of ambitious natural and working lands targets. This has been taking up most of our focus at this point this year because we have a deadline of January to determine these targets. So that has been really the main focus and charge of this Natural and Working Lands Expert Advisory Committee, and the focus of many of us state colleagues here on the line. Importantly, though, it's not just about setting targets, it's also about how are we going to implement those targets? How are we going to integrate those targets into existing state policies, such as California Air Resources Board's scoping plan that they've recently released, and the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart strategy that we at the Resources Agency lead. So sort of next year is all about how are we updating various plans, such as the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, to incorporate and integrate these targets, and most importantly, think about a pathway for implementation of those targets, and also identifying barriers to implementation of the targets. Another big piece of this bill is thinking about how do we track and measure and report on progress towards these targets. So we're required to do that. And then you'll see a couple things in here that are pretty relevant and pertinent to the Air Resources Board, and thinking about greenhouse gas emissions accounting and thinking about ways to improve modeling and analysis to make the best decisions based on the best available science. The other thing in this bill, which I've now mentioned a couple times, is that we were required to establish an expert advisory committee, which we stood up in February of this year. And we've been working really closely with that committee to help inform what these targets look like. And the committee will be giving us recommendations on the natural and working lands targets at their October meeting. And that'll be a really important time for us to take those recommendations and all the other inputs we're getting to then think about how do we actually set those targets by January 2024. I think I covered the main elements of the bill, but there's a lot in there, so I encourage you all to visit that bill, and we'll have space at the end to talk through if there's anything I haven't flagged that CARB and CDFA want to highlight. So big focus again for us right now is setting these targets. As a bit of background, California Air Resources Board rolled out their scoping plan, or their pathway to carbon neutrality, for the state of California in December of 2022. That scoping plan was super important for so many reasons, but for all of us on the line, it was important because it set a carbon stock target for natural and working lands. So we don't want to redo all of the modeling and thought and years of effort that went into that, but more so think about how do we set natural and working lands implementation targets that help us at minimum meet that carbon stock target that is set forth in the scoping plan. So implementation targets for us mean things like climate smart land management activities across all of our natural and working lands, but these could be acreage goals, percent protected or restored or managed in a climate smart way, resources and investment and capacity needs that are needed to enhance our climate smart land management. So just so you all know, we've made that pretty clear through the committee process and through this conversation here that this is about implementation targets and not new carbon targets, but really thinking about how do these implementation targets that we're setting later this year help us meet that carbon stock target at a minimum that's in the scoping plan. The other big part of the bill is that next year, by January 2025, we need to update the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy. This was a pretty important input in the scoping plan, which CARB again released in December 2022. So we want to also release the next iteration of the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy ahead of the next scoping plan. So we're working in partnership with CARB to make sure we continue to think about the role of natural and working lands in our path to carbon neutrality. What else do I want to say about this? Mainly just that this is a really important plan for us to be doing, and it is also in that plan, it's an opportunity for us to address some of the other elements of the bill, such as what are the implementation pathways for achieving these targets that we set, and also what are the other sort of actions that we need to take to achieve those targets, and what are the barriers to achieving these targets. Importantly, the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, which again is led by the Resources Agency, really feeds in and informs the scoping plan, or our pathway to carbon neutrality, but also informs another major planning effort for the state of California, which is our California Climate Adaptation Strategy, because we know our nature-based climate solutions are critical for both how are we building resilience to the impacts of climate change, and also how are we building the capacity of our lands to sustainably and resiliently store carbon over the long term. I've mentioned that we stood up this Natural and Working Lands Expert Advisory Committee to help us think through these targets and to provide recommendations to the state on what these targets should look like. We have been convening this committee about every 6 or 8 weeks since February, and this is the list of committee members that is part of that committee. This committee was determined through a competitive application process. And we really tried to cover all of the land types and affiliations and requirements that are laid out again in AB 1757. So they have been doing a great job at sort of thinking through all of the elements and complexities of setting natural and working lands targets. And again, we'll be providing us their recommendations verbally at their October meeting and then in written form later in the year. Let's see, the other thing I just wanted to flag here is the committee is charged with doing a lot of things, and it will be a committee that is established and stood up for at a minimum 2 years. But the big thing that the committee is focused on right now is helping to inform the development of this range of targets. Next year, they'll provide us a lot of input about implementation strategies and barriers to implementation and really dig into the modeling and analysis, investments and improvements that need to be made to really understand this sector. So I've mentioned a lot of the ways that we're getting input to inform these targets, obviously through the Natural and Working Lands Expert Advisory Committee, through constant conversations with my colleagues on the line, like Air Resources Board and Department of Food and Ag. But also, we know that we can't do this just within those two frameworks. So we want to hear from all of you today and in written form through September 15th. We're also starting tribal consultations and organizing a tribal workshop for later this year. And we're doing a lot of different interagency discussions across our state family, both really within the California Natural Resources Agency and the many departments and commissions and boards that are part of the Resources Agency, but also our many other agencies that could help both map out these targets and think about the pathway to achieving these targets. So our timeline here today, we are having this public listening session. We are also requesting any written comments by September 15th, and you can send that to an email that we'll drop in the chat or put on a slide at the end. So we'll take public input anyways. We'll take it through this today, which we are recording this conversation, as well as written public comment email to us. We have that committee meeting in October where they will discuss their draft recommendations and then give us a written report. And then late October through November is a lot of intense work for us in the state family of thinking through these targets, vetting them, discussing them. So that will be a pretty busy season for us. And then we will continue, of course, with the interagency discussions and the tribal engagement, and then deliver the targets by the legislative deadline of January 2024. I think that's really what I wanted to cover on sort of the details of AB 1757 and where we're at in the process. I'm sure I've missed a bunch of things, so we'll have space for Matt and Adam from CARB and any colleagues that are on the line from CDFA to jump in and clarify things. But mainly now I want to transition to hearing from you all. These are some questions that are posted on our website right now about, ideas and input that we're looking to receive from this public call for input. But please don't limit your question or your comments to just these questions, but mainly what we really want to hear from you is what should these targets be? Tell us as specifically as possible. If you have an idea of these targets, how do we measure and track and report on progress towards achieving these targets? Again, because we know a target is nothing without being able to track it and report on its progress. And what are some other things beyond just sort of targets around acreage or percentage or investment? What are other things that we need, like what we call often in the state facilitation targets, to achieve these implementation targets? So what are other policies and tools and capacity needs that we need to really deliver on these targets that we're going to set later this year? And then, as always, we are in data collection mode. So if there are resources and background documents and further context to support any of your comments here today, please include those background documents, because we'll have a lot of time to sort through those as we prepare the draft targets into the fall. So I want to pause there. I'll come back to the questions, but just I want to put this email up because I don't think the chat function is enabled. But if you have written feedback that you want to provide us either here today or by September 15th, please send all of your emails to naturebasedsolutions@resources.ca.gov. And again, we're accepting public input through September 15th. I'll go back now to the questions, and before we open it up to members of the public, I can only see Adam, but Adam or Matt from CARG or any colleagues on the line from Department of Food and Ag, is there anything you want to clarify or underscore about 1757 before we dive in?
I think you covered it very well.
Cool. Great. So now let's talk. Let's hear from you all. So if you have comments, questions, suggestions, please raise your hand. And again, we'll go in the order of the hands raised. Joan, you're up first.
Unmuted. Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciative that you're taking comment. And I'm here, I'm Joan Taylor. I'm chair of the Sierra Club's California Conservation Committee. And I'm here on behalf of the Inland Deserts Working Group, and we have engaged somewhat with your expert advisory committee, and in particular the three desert liaisons. And I'm going to take off my camera because I want to read, not miss anything. Thank you. Anyway, we appreciate this opportunity, and we want to make the point that the deserts have a lot to contribute to the state's goals of reducing atmospheric CO2 emissions. But the desert region has been largely overlooked in this for its carbon sequestration capacity due to the widespread misinterpretation about the process in the desert. And right off the bat, I'll tell you that the working group's recommended target for the desert sector is conservation of 100% of undisturbed non-military lands annually based on current levels, starting in 2024. And that regions displaying higher densities of microfill woodlands and Bajada washes be especially prioritized due to their higher capacity for carbon sequestration. So the desert region, there's a reason why it's been largely overlooked as a significant carbon sink. The scarce above ground vegetation is visually misleading if one assumes a singular correlation between above ground biomass and carbon sequestration. A key point to be understood is that the desert ecosystem primarily sequesters carbon underground. Due to persistent research underfunding, the desert sector remains woefully behind in companion ecosystems such as forests and wetlands in terms of quantifying, measuring, and modeling its carbon sequestration. But there is more than sufficient research to make this point. The desert lands of California are a significant carbon sink and must be included in regional and global and statewide carbon accounting. Under CARB's recommendation, which is to cut land conversion of deserts by only 50% starting 2025, the desert region will not recover carbon that is lost when that land is disturbed. And it certainly will not recover it within the time scale of this planning effort nor with any human timescale. And once the carbon is stored underground in caliche soil layers, it remains there upwards for thousands of years if left undisturbed. So it's critical to understand that CARB's recommendation would result in permanent loss of carbon storage for all desert land that becomes disturbed. The scientific reality forms the backbone of our recommendation, and we urge the CNRA and CARB to pivot their framework in the desert region from acres of land conversion to conservation of undisturbed desert lands and identification of appropriate disturbed lands across the state that will jointly serve our state's development and carbon sequestration goals. We have prepared, we being mostly experts, with me as an expert activist, have prepared a white paper on this subject, and the 3 desert liaisons of the EAC have gotten this, and we will be submitting it by the deadline, but wanted to get our message out early and often. So the main thing is primarily scientists have quantified a very significant amount of carbon in the desert. We need research to better quantify and model it. But in the meantime, disturbing desert releases carbon and it won't be restored in any human timescale. So we urge you, first, do no harm. And furthermore, since solar energy, we all know we need it, but it is the biggest land conversion threat to the deserts today. We urge the CNRA and CARB to engage. Glad to hear you're engaging with other state agencies, but in particular, CPUC and CARB. It's important to get in sync with them and move forward very, very carefully on the desert. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm available for questions if you have them. And the white paper can explain all the specifics. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Joan. We'll move now to Paul Mason.
Hey, thanks, Jen. Good evening, Adam, and everyone else who's hiding off camera right now. I just want to highlight a few things, not reiterate everything that's in our letter that we'll send you at some point. And obviously, I defer to my boss who's on the advisory committee. But I mean, our fundamental problem in forests is that they just look absolutely nothing like they did before colonization of California. You know, we've lost the overwhelming majority of the big old trees. They're way too dense. We've fire suppressed. These are all things that are pretty commonly known, but we don't get to the other side of the challenge that we have without fundamentally changing the structure of our forests, getting the big trees back, the spacing back, and changing the management going forward. And that's where working forest conservation comes in. There's just simply no way to get to the conditions that are, you know, almost universally recognized as where we want to be for long-term resilience for fire and for carbon on the landscape without that permanent change in management. So when we talk about these, what feel like very aggressive or large goals for conservation of working forests, and particularly industrially managed forests that are otherwise going to be on, you know, short rotation, clear cut sort of harvest, that's why, is because we don't change the way they're managed unless we're applying conservation to help secure those change management commitments. So our letter will have some more specific, you know, acres by X date, but I think it's really the why. And that's, you know, of course, ties into 30 by 30 and our biodiversity efforts and our watershed restoration efforts. But fundamentally, if we don't change the business model for forestry and the economic model for forestry, we don't change how forests are managed. And conservation is a critical tool for that. Next piece of it is obviously fire. We have too much bad fire, not enough good fire, pretty broad recognition of where we need to go there. And one of the biggest pieces of this is social, just getting people to accept that there is such a thing as good and necessary fire, and there's going to be some smoke in the air, and, you know, that's better than having an overwhelming amount of smoke in the air. But one of the things that I've been particularly encouraged by, and they're doing this up on the North Coast as part of the planning they're doing under the Corona Conservation's regional planning program through the North Coast Resource Partnership, is really expanding the pods model they use on the Forest Service lands, the potential operational wildfire delineations, and expanding that across the landscape so that well before we're dealing with wildfires, we have identified and socialized with the public, through community forums and fire safe councils and stuff, where are useful operational fire breaks on the landscape. So we know where we're going to be using those for wildfire response purposes, but we can also use those for prescribed fire and for cultural fire, and use those proactively in order to restore and maintain the desired condition on the landscape. So setting some goals regionally, probably by CAL FIRE district or unit, for development of a framework of where we can, manage the units that we can manage fire on the landscape by, 2026 by unit. So there's some accountability there. I think it would be a really valuable way to start shifting that conversation from, the expectation that we're just going to suppress fire to here is the framework we're going to use to manage fire. It'll also cause less disruption on the landscape as, when we have a wildfire, all of a sudden all the rules go out the window and we're just driving a bulldozer down the hillside to try and get a line around the fire. And if we're planning ahead, we don't have the same sorts of impacts. The last thing I just want to flag, and it's, it's driven home for me as I was going over some different documents earlier, trying to understand the status of, for example, there was a Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force meeting yesterday. They're going to be working on their action plan update next year. They've got contracts out for doing more refined modeling to have the million-acre strategy be something more than just big round numbers. There's that contract. There's the work that FRAP's been doing. There's the long simmering AB 1492 stuff that I know Adam's familiar with. And so I guess it's just an ongoing question for me how we get alignment between these other fire and forest planning processes that honestly are driven by entities that are more central to that. How do we get alignment between what's being proposed, for example, in the action plan update, which granted the timing is not perfect here, versus what's coming out of the scoping plan or this process? So that's, a little more of an open-ended challenge because, there's deadlines that don't quite match up there, but it's not going to be useful if we're creating one goal or target in this process that's not tied in some fashion to what's happening through these other state contracts and planning processes. So those are the three things that I wanted to flag. And we'll send you something in writing.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay, who's up next? Joss, I think.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and hello to everybody hiding here. So my name is Joss Hill. I'm representing the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I'm the project director for California within our US Conservation Program. Pew is also planning to submit a letter as well, which with allies, which folk can sign on to as well. And that is going to be at tinyurl.com/Blue Carbon 2023. So I can put that in the chat. So I'll just make a few comments here. I overall strongly support leveraging protection, restoration, and improved management of natural and working lands to advance state climate goals with respect to carbon neutrality, adaptation, and resilience. But I'm specifically going to make some comments address what's known as blue carbon, which is not fully represented in the 2022 climate change scoping plan, and so should be considered in this new effort to set targets for natural and working lands. The blue carbon refers to the carbon captured and stored in coastal and ocean ecosystems, and California's blue carbon habitats include tidally influenced wetlands like tidal swamps, marsh, seagrass, and seaweeds like kelp. And coastal wetlands in particular are recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for their ability to efficiently capture and store carbon at rates vastly exceeding those of tropical forests. So the IPCC developed accounting methodologies for those ecosystems so that they can be included in country and state level climate plans. And so for that reason, as well as the many other co-benefits, conserving and restoring coastal habitats will provide other benefits like protecting coastal and flooding, shoreline erosion, water quality improvements, and biodiversity support. So urge you to include specific targets for these habitats. And so specifically, what we recommend is a landscape approach to conservation. And that is one, protecting all the remaining coastal wetlands from loss. California's lost about 90% of our wetlands, so preventing further loss is critical. And so to do that, we recommend a few approaches. One, putting all the remaining coastal wetlands under conservation status. We also need to reduce the threats, upstream threats, so that we don't lose more, such as water pollution. Better tracking of permitted impacts to help reduce those impacts, mitigate them, and strengthening California's no net loss of ecosystem function goal. Second, building resilience of coastal wetlands to sea level rise and other climate threats. And so this would include also a landscape approach, like protecting migration space, restoring upstream water and sediment flows, and allowing for use of dredge where appropriate. Thirdly, accelerating restoration efforts of coastal wetlands where feasible, and in particular to focus on areas that haven't received as much investment, like the North and Central Coast. Fourth, the IPCC does not yet recognize kelp and other marine sources of blue carbon. We do recommend investing in continued research to better understand the climate contribution of these systems. And to measure progress, recommend improving the natural working lands greenhouse gas inventory for coastal wetlands, as well as sort of aligning this with and setting up a statewide mapping and monitoring program for coastal wetlands. In terms of policy venues that can support blue carbon, California's 30 by 30 goal, the Climate Smart Strategy, Ocean Protection Council Strategic Plan, and the Coastal Conservancy Strategic Plan all represent frameworks that could help deliver on these targets. And then finally, California is fortunate to have a lot of great research capacity for blue carbon and coastal habitats. And so in particular, I recommend referring to things like the Nature Conservancy's Hope for the Coast and the San Francisco Estuary Institute, leveraging wetlands for a better climate future. So thank you so much for the opportunity to provide comments, and we'll be providing written comment also.
Great, thanks, Joss. Appreciate that. So for folks that just joined, we are taking public comments. So if you have a comment, put yourself in the queue, and we'll ask you to come off mute and provide your public comment, because I see a couple new people on the line, and we're asking people to speak to any and all of the questions on the screen or other things they would like to share in the context of AB 1757 targets. Bonnie, over to you.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Bonnie Bunyol with the Climate Center. First of all, thank you all of the folks at CNRA, CARB, and CDFA, all the work that you've all put into this process. We understand that the timeline is short and the lift is heavy, so your leadership is highly valued. I'm a part of a coalition of NGOs working to scale up the role of natural and working lands in our fight against climate change, and we've been working to provide robust recommendations for each land type, many of which my colleagues have already spoken about today. I'd like to uplift two recommendations specific to ag lands. First is the need to drastically scale up the use of compost on both rangelands and croplands. Compost application is already the highest in demand strategy in CDFA's Healthy Soils program, accounting for 65% of the acreage reached since 2017. It also offers vital GHG benefits, both in terms of carbon sequestration and avoided nitrous oxide and methane emissions. SB 1383 offers a pivotal and needed offers a pivotal opportunity and need for interagency collaboration, as the increase in feedstock for compost directly relates to the health of our working lands. In fact, according to a 2020 report, approximately 15.5 million tons of organic waste can be diverted from our landfills. And using CARB's conversion rate for organic feedstock to compost production, this could result in approximately 9 million tons of compost per year, which in turn could be applied to 1.35 million acres of croplands annually. However, standing up these compost facilities continues to be a challenge with immense permitting hurdles, both in terms of associated costs and time. We recommend interagency collaboration to cut the green tape and increase the state's capacity to process higher rates of organic waste. Additionally, it's evident from scientific literature that stacking regenerative agriculture practices results in the highest impact for climate, biodiversity, and health benefits. So you recommend incentivizing the adoption of multiple practices on the same parcels of land whenever possible. Second, to actualize the implementation of the targets that will be set forth by the 1757 process, the state must invest further in technical assistance. Resource conservation districts specifically are in a unique position to tap into their existing networks and local expertise that they've developed over the past 80 years in California. They are, however, also unique in that they are a public entity that is forced to rely on grant funding to operate. In fact, California is one of 2 states in the country that does not provide dedicated public funding to its RCDs. This limitation forces the RCDs to use much of their valuable time and resources in grant writing, eating into their capacity to assist farmers in planning, implementing, and seeking public funding to implement climate beneficial practices on their lands. We highly recommend prioritizing the funding for these boots on the ground in order to meet our state goals. The need for specific strategic partnerships, such as the one with RCDs, has already been highlighted in state plans, such as the 2019 NWL Climate Change Implementation Plan. We'd like to see the funding to follow these recommendations. Thank you for this opportunity to provide public comment, and we look forward to future opportunities for engagement.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. Chuck Mills, you're up next.
Hey, thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for hosting this, especially at a time where more people could participate as they're, getting off work and getting into opportunities to be able to spend a couple hours here. First, I really just want to uplift everything that the speakers before me said. So, really hats off to Paul, Josh, Joan, and Bonnie for raising those issues, and completely support everything that they said. I'm actually going to be incredibly quick. I'm going to speak to developed lands, which, as you know, within the confines of the scoping plan, was pretty much focused on urban forestry. And the reason I'm going to be quick is that from my perspective, the state really has all the tools it needs to move forward here, with one exception, which I'll save for last. But looking at question 1 here, targets, the state passed AB 2251 last year, which CARB correctly deferred to in the scoping plan, for the 10% canopy increase above current levels by 2035. That is an ambitious target. We think it is doable with the tools that are available to state. With regard to the targets proposed and how to suggest we measure progress, the legislation lays out a framework there for CARB to take the lead in developing a strategic plan and offers guidance along the way in terms of focusing and prioritizing on underserved communities where there's tremendous opportunity for increased canopy and open space. It also happens to be the areas where we're seeing the most extreme heat, especially when you're looking at the valley and spots of Southern California that are designated as disadvantaged. It also offers a roadmap in terms of building partnerships and setting regional targets. So I think the tools are there for that. Relevant supporting background and data. The legislation was really based off of the 2018 Forest Carbon Plan developed by CNRA and CAL FIRE. And I think within there's several robust pages that really points to peer-reviewed science and articles and journals that provide the background, the data, and the studies that we need to be able to hit that 10% canopy increase. So that really leaves policy tools, frameworks, and investment. And I'm going to focus briefly on investment because the one challenge that I see here is the lack of investment. And CARB correctly modified its original recommendation for this section of 20% above baseline funding levels to 200% above baseline funding levels based on the requirement under AB 2251. I think it's important to note that the first state budget that came out and was ultimately approved a month or so ago after the scoping plan was adopted in December actually dramatically disinvested in urban forestry and urban greening. So the budget proposed in and adopted in 2022 provided $220 million to urban forestry and urban greening over 2 years. The budget approved, I guess, 2 months ago now, stripped all of the money for urban forestry, so zeroed it out completely. So 100% disinvestment, and then an 85% disinvestment in urban greening, dropping that down to 25 million. As a consequence of the urban forestry disinvestment, CAL FIRE was not able to even staff the required statutory necessity of creating a framework for AB 2251 and to develop that strategic plan, which they need to present to the legislature administration by, I believe it's July 2025. So they lost a full year in being able to act on that legislation because their budget was zeroed out. So it's difficult to get excited about some of the suggestions, well, not suggestions, the statutory requirement, the tools available to the administration when we see this heavy disinvestment, not only in developed lands, but in other lands, that my colleague spoke to in forest and ag, et cetera. So I just want to really highlight that I think the tools are there. I think the 200% investment above baseline is appropriate. We just need to see those funds be put to action so that CAL FIRE and the other state entities charged with developed lands can move on this, quickly. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. And then next up we have Jacob.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to comment. Really appreciate it. I'm Jacob Evans on behalf of Stereocope, California. I want to just briefly touch on and read out 3 considerations we believe should be vital to targets involving forests set by AB 1757. First, if forest treatments are included in AB 1757 plans, they should be accompanied by corresponding carbon accounting for the effects of treatments and how different forest types are impacted by them. For example, carbon accounting must take into account the differences in carbon loss post-fire in thin versus unthinned forests. Forest treatments may impact carbon sequestration efforts, and understand their impact will allow for the proper carbon accounting needed to inform plans required by this bill. Second, management strategies and effective risk reduction solutions need to be tailored to the specific conditions of California's diverse ecosystems. Forest type, fire risk, climate resilience, vulnerability to regime change, and other disturbance variables should be considered when determining best management practices, harvesting guidelines, and other interventions. And finally, Stereocope, California believes the use of biomass incinerators as a solution for wood residue must be reduced in order to, sorry, my cat just jumped on my table. In order to curb California's overall emissions. Wood releases about 25% more CO2 per unit of primary energy than fuel oil and about 75% more CO2 than fossil gas. Biomass incineration is incompatible with California's carbon neutrality goals, and we recommend that it should be minimized in AB 1757 plans. Thanks again for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Jacob. I don't see any other hands up. So encourage you all, if you haven't spoken up or you want to revise your comment or add another comment, please do so. We will definitely keep the line open till 6. And do want to really thank you all for not only providing these really articulate and clear comments to us here, but also providing us any written ideas too. So thanks for being so engaged in this process. So also, if you're done giving public comment, you can leave too. Don't feel trapped in this conversation, but we will stay on if others that are getting off their workday want to hop on and provide any comments. And as a reminder, email us any thoughts you have by September 15th to this email below. And if you're curious, listen in to our next Natural and Working Lands Expert Advisory Committee meeting on October 12th. And if there are folks that want to give final comments, no need to raise your hand, just jump in. And yeah, and I know we have Adam and Virginia on the line, and I think Matt Botel still too. So again, if anyone wants to, from the state team, chime in and add anything else or respond to anything, please do. Hi, Eileen, do you have a comment?
I do, yes.
Great.
I just became aware of this meeting earlier this afternoon, so I don't have a great list of comments to provide. My name's Eileen Anderson. I'm a senior scientist and the California Desert Director for the Center for Biological Diversity. And I've been working primarily on conservation issues in the non-forested lands in Southern California. So one point I wanted to make, and I made this also at the Expert Advisory Council meeting last week, I think it was. Many of the plant communities in Southern California anyway are primarily dominated by coastal scrubs, chaparral. Of course, there's the deserts that were already spoken to, and grasslands. And all of those types of plant communities are basically overlooked for their unique carbon sequestration capacities. Conserving ecologically functional carbon sequestrating landscapes is really beneficial, regardless of if they have trees on them or not. I think that California needs to do everything they can and use every type of habitat or plant community out there for their carbon sequestration advantages, and not just focus on those that may sequester the most, but also may burn the most. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the benefits to conserving some of these non-forested lands. I think it also helps California reach our goals for the 30 by 30 effort, so that we do conserve, our plant community here is one of the top biodiversity hotspots on the planet. And so in recognizing our obligation through the 30 by 30 to conserve these unique plants and our plant communities, this is another benefit for our carbon sequestration as well as our 30 by 30 goals. It also protects a lot of imperiled species, not just plants, but animals as well. And that's going to help slow our ongoing extinction crisis. So another benefit. And then also, I think it's much more fiscally prudent to protect ecologically functional habitats than to have to restore degraded habitats. Now, myself and my organization certainly are supportive of going ahead and restoring these degraded lands, because that also provides benefit. It's just that there's a temporal difference between restoring someplace as versus conserving an ecologically functional area. So basically you get the most bang out of your buck for not only carbon sequestration in these ecologically functional areas, but it's also just a better deal. So as I said, I did speak with the Expert Advisory Committee and noted to them that we recently published a report on carbon sequestration of non-forested terrestrial landscapes, and we'll be submitting that report along with our comments by September 15th. I also want to recognize, and echo the comments made about what a heavy lift you have right now in getting all these deadlines met and doing it in a comprehensive manner. And just really want to thank you for your time and all of your efforts, because I imagine it's a mad scramble, and appreciate you taking the time to have this public input today, as well as other times too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. Appreciate it. So for other folks on the line, we're keeping the line open for a bit. I'm going to go off camera, but we're here if you decide to provide public comment. And yeah, thanks.